It wasn't an apostolic exhortation, nor a solemn homily in St. Peter's Square. The final legacy that Pope Francis, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, left to the world began with the simplest of things. A handwritten letter, an old photograph, a worn wooden chair, and an anonymous scholarship fund. In his final days, as his health declined and preparations for his funeral quietly began, the Pope admired by millions chose instead to return to being a brother, an uncle, a human being, filled with both regret and love. No more vestments, no throne, no applause. Only silence and sincerity remained, things that brought tears to his family's eyes when they realized that behind the figure of the supreme spiritual father, he was still Jorge, the one they had known, loved, and now would forever miss. If you find these stories truly inspiring and touching, don't forget to leave a comment. Type 1 if you resonate with the characters or feel connected to this emotional journey, or 0 if you have a different opinion. On April 21st, 2025, Easter Monday, at the Domus Sanctae Marthi, the humble residence Pope Francis once called home, the alarm rang at 7:35 a.m. His heart had stopped after a fatal stroke. He passed away in silence, just as he had lived, simply rejecting pomp and always avoiding lavish privileges. Yet what moved both the Vatican and especially his family in Argentina most deeply was not the news of his passing, but the profound emptiness he left behind. The very next day, officials from the Holy See began inventorying his belongings. Pope Francis's personal room bore no resemblance to that of the leader of over 1 billion Catholics worldwide. There were no luxury watches, no gold-plated crucifixes, no bank cards, no safes, no valuable paintings, and no storage rooms. All they found were a few simple items: clothing, a pair of worn-out shoes, some theology books marked with pencil notes, a picture of the Virgin Mary hanging beside the bed, and an old Bible with a spine so tattered it was barely holding together. A cardinal murmured, "He left without taking anything, except peace." When his family, especially his devoted sister Maria Elena Bergoglio, was informed about the state of his personal belongings, they wept, not out of poverty, but because of the radical nature of Jorge's lifelong choice to give things up. He was a man who left us nothing, and in doing so, left us everything. Later, in an interview with Clarín, Maria Elena shared that this voluntary poverty came as no surprise to those who had followed Francis's life from the very first day he became pope. He refused to live in the apostolic palace, where previous popes had resided in lavishly decorated rooms served by dozens of attendants. Instead, he chose the Domus Sanctae Marthi, the Vatican guest house, where he lived like an ordinary priest, eating with other cardinals in the communal dining hall, serving himself, and never using a limousine. He didn't own a personal credit card. All nominal income from his office was directed to the Vatican's general fund, with a small portion allocated for his pastoral visits, not for himself, but for organizing meetings with the poor, the sick, and refugees. When a journalist asked him in 2020 whether he owned anything personal, he just smiled. "An old pair of shoes, a rosary, and too many prayers in my pocket." His family were middle-class Italian immigrants in Buenos Aires. They have never received any wealth or privileges since he became pope. No villas were built, no scholarships were named after the Bergoglio family, and no trust funds were created for his descendants. "We continue to live the way we always have," his nephew once said, and Jorge never wanted that to change. When legal experts reviewed the officially stored will, they found only a simple clause. "I leave no personal possessions. Please use whatever remains to help the poor access education." There were no assets, no heirs, no instructions regarding property or transferable bank accounts. Pope Francis's entire material legacy was summarized on a sheet of paper hardly worth mentioning, and it was precisely this that made his spiritual legacy priceless. And in doing so, he left behind more than any pope before him, Cardinal Kevin Farrell said in a memorial address. Media reports noted that when Maria Elena received the list of Jorge's personal belongings, a simple sheet of paper sent to her by the Vatican, she remained silent for a long moment before saying, "He left this world just as our mother taught us, to take nothing with us but a kind heart." Pope Francis once said, "A poor church for the poor." But perhaps what he never made explicit was that the Pope must also be the poorest among them. And now, as his room at the Domus Sanctae Marthae stands empty, with nothing left behind to be locked away, but instead carried in the hearts of others, poverty has become the most powerful symbol of Francis's life. These are letters from a brother who was never just a pope. It is said that a pope leaves behind apostolic exhortations, encyclicals, and historic speeches for posterity. But Pope Francis, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, before passing away on the morning of Easter Monday, April 21, 2025, left behind something very different. A deeply personal and emotionally profound legacy reserved for his loved ones. It was not a sermon, nor a theological will. These were handwritten letters, not printed or typed, sent to his sister, nieces and nephews, and a few childhood friends in Buenos Aires. According to revelations from the Vatican archives, a total of 11 letters were found in the drawer of his desk at the Domus Sanctae Marthae. Each letter was neatly numbered and sealed with red wax. The letters were dated from January to early April 2025, as if he had sensed the impending departure. Notably, the first letter was marked Elena, addressed to Elena, the only person who always knew what I was going to say before I even said anything. According to Maria Elena, the contents of the letters had nothing to do with the Vatican, reforms, or church politics. On the contrary, they were heartfelt memories, almost fragmented recollections from a brother, someone who wanted to share before saying goodbye. In one letter, Jorge recalled a morning in 1961 when they both rode bicycles to the Flores Church to serve Mass for the first time. He wrote, "I never told you, but that day, if you hadn't encouraged me, I might have given up and would have never become a priest, let alone a pope." And he concluded with the words, "So if anyone is responsible for all of this, it's you." Maria Elena recounted in a conversation with Radio Meter that when she read that part, she cried. Not only because of the emotion, but because for the first time, Jorge forced himself to say something he had never expressed during all their years together. Another letter was written to his nephew Ignacio, who had lost his father when he was very young and had been cared for by Jorge for a brief time. Francis wrote, "I leave you no material possessions, but perhaps I have passed down something more important." Never let silence fill the place of justice. This quote, after being revealed in an informal press conference in Buenos Aires, quickly spread across social media. It was regarded as the most important political testament Francis had ever written, but it was a testament for his family, not for the world. No one in his family knew about the existence of these letters. No one could have imagined that in the final months of his life, despite his declining health, having to meet with diplomats, and preparing for his funeral, Pope Francis quietly returned to being a normal person, a brother, an uncle, an old friend. No throne, no robes, just Jorge, in flesh and blood, taking a moment for himself. In his final handwritten letter to his sister, there was a passage that brought tears to the eyes of the entire family. "I am sorry for not being present at Mother's memorial. I am sorry for missing my niece's wedding day. I am sorry that whenever something happens in the family, I can only make a quick phone call before disappearing again due to my schedule. Being Pope was never a good enough reason to lose the part of Jorge that you once knew. No flowery words, no clerical authority, just genuine regret. A family member left this, not for the world, but for his own loved ones." When the letters were given to Maria Elena and other family members, they decided not to release the full content. They only shared a few excerpts with the press to show that Jorge never forgot who he was, even after becoming one of the most powerful people in the world. At the upcoming funeral, one of the letters is expected to be read as part of the farewell. These lines are short but heavy with meaning. "If there is one thing I regret most in my life, it is that I did not say thank you often enough." The family has decided to print these letters into a small book, not to be widely published, but to be preserved for future generations. So when they ask about Jorge Bergoglio, they will not just hear about a pope, but about a brother, an uncle, an ordinary man, a man who loved with the quietest part of his life. Perhaps this is what marked the profound difference in Francis's final legacy, not for the church, but for those he loved the most, in the form of his true self, no throne, no robes, not the Pope, but Jorge. On the Wednesday after Pope Francis's passing, the Vatican released a special appendix. Along with his spiritual will came a statement. He did not divide his assets, because there was nothing significant to share, except for a silent act never before mentioned. If the story of Pope Francis's quiet yet profound legacy resonates with you, leave a like as a simple way for us to spread kindness together. You can also share this video with those who need a reminder that kindness still exists in this world. And if you want to continue following authentic, inspiring stories about humanity, faith, and compassion, don't forget to follow the channel. In a brief document of fewer than 400 words, sealed in an envelope, the Vatican revealed a surprising piece of information. Pope Francis had quietly used his modest savings from his nominal salary to establish a scholarship fund. The fund was named after his mother, Regina Maria Sivori. Its official name is Fondo Regina Regina. No one, not even his sister Maria Elena, knew about the existence of this fund. From the very beginning, Francis had stipulated that his name was not to be used in any public activities related to the fund, and it was only to be disclosed after his death. Even more remarkably, this scholarship fund was not intended for seminarians or theology students. It was not designated for anyone within the clergy. It was specifically for homeless children, stateless children, those with no access to education. The children living in Buenos Aires, where he had once seen their hungry eyes as a young priest. Attached to the file was a handwritten dedication, "For those who do not have what I have." The first person to cry when reading this appendix was not a cardinal or a member of the Vatican Curia. It was Maria Elena, his sister. She said in a brief press conference in Flores, "Jorge didn't just preach about poverty. He lived in it. He chose it. And he gave back everything he could to it." According to financial documents confirmed by an intermediary organization, the Fondo Regina Fund, quietly received monthly contributions from Pope Francis since 2015. In total, it accumulated around 380,000 euros over more than 10 years. All of these funds were sent through an anonymous charity in Argentina to avoid attention. And most notably, he requested that the fund be entrusted to the missionaries of charity for management. He did not want any clergy or Vatican administrative bodies to intervene. For a very clear reason, they were the only ones who never asked about power, but only about needs. In the fund's activity report, there was a handwritten note. "I don't want anyone to know that I'm behind this. But if these children have the chance to go to school, then that is a debt I must repay." A debt to the children who once clung to his legs and asked, "Father, what can you do for me?" Scheiß. In the Villa 31 slum, where Francis had served as Father Jorge, news of the Fondo Regina spread faster than any press release. An older nun here said, "He used to come here with muddy shoes. Now he returns in a different way." Those who knew Jorge in his quiet service have now seen him present once more, not through a title, not through a throne, but through one final act, silent but everlasting. The letters, the scholarship fund, and the apologies in the letters all convey the same message. Francis didn't try to leave a legacy for the world, but to leave himself for those who knew him before he became Pope. A man who knew how to love and be grateful in the quietest way. In the first week after the fund was announced, more than 200 applications from immigrant families, homeless children, and those without documents were submitted in hopes of becoming the first students to receive a scholarship that no one ever imagined would come from a pope. But why was such a remarkable act kept a secret? Perhaps the answer lies in the final personal note that Francis wrote in his diary. "We are living in an era where even kindness is suspected of being a tool to gain trust. I don't need trust for myself. I only need it for the children." Not everyone agreed with his approach. Some advisors at the Vatican believed the Pope should not personalize social responsibility. But if there is anything that made this action extraordinary, it is the silence. The silence that rejected glory, the choice not to leave a trace, but to leave results. His family did not inherit any material wealth, but they received a spiritual gift greater than any inheritance, the truth that Jorge had lived fully according to his conscience. They could not hold back tears when they saw the small plaque engraved with the words, Fondina Porlob. This plaque was placed in front of a makeshift classroom made of corrugated metal in Buenos Aires, the very place where Francis had once taught catechism as a young seminarian. The photo of that classroom was later framed by Maria Elena and hung in her living room. The photo was not a symbol of victory. It was evidence of her brother's silent choice to never keep kindness to himself. Among the few personal belongings found at Doma Sanctae Martha, the final residence of Pope Francis, was a small object that had initially gone unnoticed. It was an old, yellowed photograph hidden inside a Spanish-language theology book published in 1980. The photo had no silver frame, no lamination, no luxury at all. But when the photo was taken out, the entire room fell silent. It was a family photograph taken on the porch of a house in the Flores neighborhood of Buenos Aires in the summer of 1964. In the photo, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, about 28 years old at the time, stands next to his mother Regina, his father Mario Jose, and his sister Maria Elena. The house behind them is a modest one-story home. Nothing remarkable, but the smiles on each of their faces, especially Jorge's, are captivating. On the back of the photo, there is a faint yet certain handwritten note. Perdón. Aquí es donde aprendí todo sobre el perdón. Sorry, this is where I learned everything about forgiveness. No one at the Vatican knew he always carried this photo with him. No one, not even his family, knew the photo still existed. When Maria Elena was shown the photo, she cried like a child and said, "I thought it had been lost long ago." She recalls that Jorge had once taped this photo to the head of his bed when he was a philosophy student. Later, when he studied theology in Chile and entered the seminary, the photo disappeared. She never imagined he had kept it all these years. What is special is not just the photo, but the meaning that Francis attached to it. According to a close priest, he carried the photo with him on most of his international pastoral trips, from Manila to Lampedusa, from Congo to Canada. It was always kept in his personal suitcase, alongside books and rosaries. The photo was a silent symbol of a past he had never shared publicly. "When I saw the photo, I understood why he lived the way he did," said a close assistant. "Not because he was the Pope, but because he was always the son of that house." A disciple of forgiveness, nurtured from that place. The photo, which the Vatican later confirmed had never been published, had never appeared in any documents, photo exhibitions, or official biographies of Pope Francis. Unconsciously, he had chosen to keep the most sacred thing for himself, a corner of memory not to be displayed, but to be preserved. The most touching detail was a note he left in his brief will. The note read, "If there is one place I would want to return to, it is this photo." Not to his homeland, not to Argentina, not to a church, but to that photo. Vatican historians immediately regarded this as one of the most profound personal symbols a pope had ever left behind. In an era where all leadership images are carefully crafted, staged, and tightly controlled, Francis's old family photo appeared as a cut against the tradition of power. It reminded the world that no matter where he was, he remained just a son, a brother, a child who had once been loved in Buenos Aires. When the photo was returned to the family, Maria Elena did something unexpected. She enlarged the photo, not to display it in a church, but to gift it to a school for children with disabilities, a school Jorge had supported in the 1990s. She said, "My brother wanted to give this photo so the children could see it every day. That is how he wanted to be remembered." A photo not featured on the cover of books, not displayed in the Vatican Museum, but nestled in the hearts of children he had never met. Yet somehow, they still knew to be grateful to him. Not because he was the Pope, but because he was Jorge. And so, the small photo that had been hidden in a suitcase for decades was placed in the hallway of the school with a sign that read, "This is where Pope Francis learned everything about forgiveness." The photo was not shocking, not secretive, not revealing or sensational, but it carried a weight that made anyone who stopped to look unable to walk away. Because it reminded them that behind a pope was a person, and behind every person was a memory. And perhaps memory is the last and deepest thing we leave for those we love. It is not a symbol of power, but a reminder of quiet presence, a presence that doesn't need a title to become eternal. While the Vatican was busy preparing for the official funeral of Pope Francis, a piece of information quietly spread from the Office of the Doctrine. This is where the theological and spiritual documents of the popes are stored. The information left those observing the Vatican speechless, not because of any political or canonical reason, but because of the existence of an unpublished letter. It was kept in a light blue folder, with a note confirming the date of March 13, 2013. the exact day Jorge Mario Bergoglio was elected Pope. The 3-page handwritten letter in Italian was not addressed to any specific recipient on the front. However, in the opening, Pope Francis wrote, "Dear Padre Hans," a phrase that expresses both respect and familiarity. According to the records, the recipient was Father Hans Zner, a German theologian and one of Jorge's private confessors when he was the Archbishop of Buenos Aires. The content of the letter was not intended to explain the Church's politics. It was not a directive for the leadership either. Instead, it was an apology, a silent confession, a spiritual will meant only for the person who had seen him at his most vulnerable. I entered the conclave with empty hands, but I left with something heavier than anything: responsibility and sins I could never name. He did not specify what those sins were. However, later in the letter, there is a passage that particularly emphasizes his time in Argentina during the 1970s and 1980s. This was a bloody period under the military dictatorship when many priests and lay people were kidnapped, tortured, and killed. It was a time when Bergoglio himself was questioned. Did he remain silent when he should have spoken out? I chose silence out of fear, out of a desire to protect my brothers. But silence is also a form of denial, and I owe them. Not a material debt, but a debt of the soul. No one had ever asked him to apologize for this. Even though some human rights organizations had criticized him in the early 2000s, Pope Francis was later exonerated by the very survivors. But he never felt relieved. This letter was accompanied by a special clause. It was not to be published, not to be circulated, and only to be opened if he passed away without being able to express these words to the public himself. And now, the time had come. The Vatican had contacted the family. The purpose was to seek permission to share a copy of the letter as part of his spiritual legacy. His relatives were completely stunned. No one in the family, not even Maria Elena, had ever heard him mention this. But after reading it, she simply said, "Jorge always apologized for things no one ever blamed him for." There was a part of the letter dedicated specifically to the family. Perhaps that's why the Vatican decided to share it. If one day I cannot return to Argentina, please remember that it is still the place where I owe my family, my country, and my conscience so much. The family decided not to make the entire letter public. However, they agreed to store an excerpt at the Vatican as a scripture of humility, according to Cardinal Kurt Coe. Western theologians regarded this as unprecedented, a document in which a reigning pope, on the very day of his coronation, chose confession over self-glorification. A pope who began his papacy not with a grand sermon, but with a quiet confession to his past. One Catholic scholar remarked, "He did not leave behind a great theological will, but this letter alone is enough for future generations to understand that the truth does not lie in power, but in the courage to admit one's mistakes." When the family placed a copy of the letter next to the old photograph in their home in Flores, where Jorge had called the place where I learned everything about forgiveness, everyone fell silent. There were no tears, no anger, only a wave of very human emotion. It was the relief of knowing that Jorge had returned to God with a whole soul. A completeness not born of power, but from the fact that he had never lost himself. The letters, the photographs, and the quiet actions became the small bricks that built his final portrait. A man who left no material legacy, but left behind kindness, like a light that continues to spread. No longer Jorge, but Jorge, present through forgiveness. Although Pope Francis has passed away, his presence is felt more clearly than ever. Not through statues or grand canonization ceremonies, but through the eyes of the children receiving scholarships from the Fondo Regina. Through handwritten letters, through the piece of paper left by a man who dared to apologize. The Vatican later decided to leave the room as it was, without renovation or opening it to the public. However, they made a note in their internal records that this was the final space of a man who had rejected the material throne to build a throne in the hearts of humanity. This was an unprecedented decision for any pope before. Months later, Maria Elena returned to Rome once again. This time, not to say goodbye, but to give the chair that Pope Francis had used to write his letters. A simple wooden chair, slightly wobbly. It wasn't gilded, it wasn't inlaid with jewels, but it bore the weight of the deepest things a person could write. The chair was given to a poor school in Argentina, where children who had never heard the name Jorge would sit and learn in the quiet continuation of love. Before leaving Doma Sanctae Marthae, she paused before the door that closed behind her. She placed her hand on the doorknob and whispered, "You left nothing for me, but I've received everything." And that is exactly the case. Jorge Mario Bergoglio did not leave behind wealth, power, or symbols of fame, but he left behind a model of living, where the Pope did not stand above humanity, but was among them, where holiness begins not with power, but with humility, and where death is not the end, but the door opening to an immortal legacy. No need for a grand tombstone, just an old photo, a sincere apology, and a quiet chair in a poor classroom. That's how a life is remembered, not by a crown, but by the heart, a heart that lived, loved, and forgave. The story of Pope Francis's final legacy is not just about letters, scholarships, or an old photo. It's a reminder. Kindness, forgiveness, and love leave the deepest marks. If you felt something when hearing his final words, leave a like as a quiet tribute. Share this video with someone you think needs to hear this today, because sometimes a story like this might be the only thing that helps someone stay strong in life. And if you believe in the value of simple yet genuine things, don't forget to follow the channel, subscribe, so you won't miss the next stories. Perhaps the next video will be something you need, or something someone else needs and you'll share.